Hello everybody, Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. My name is Eran Baruch, and I'm the head of Bina, the social movement for social change. I'm very honored to open this evening here in Israel, morning or noon in the United States, for everybody to join us to have a discussion and a panel 25 years after Rabin's murder. Bina was established as an organization a few months after Rabin's murder, in trying people who established Bina wanted to build a bridge between Judaism and democracy. The murder was a conflict that been shot in 3 gunshots between Judaism and democracy. And this conflict still exists in Israel 25 years later. And I hope this evening we'll be able to discuss this conflict and antagonism between Judaism and Halakha and Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. This is like an Israeli discussion, but when our mind in one place on the election next week in the United States as Jews, and Israel as a young democracy who's struggling to be Jewish on one hand and democracy on the other hand, the 25 years after the murder, we want to check and see where are we now in this debate. And I'm very honored to pass the leadership to Judy to open the discussion. Thank you all for joining us. I see people are gathering like in the square to come and listen and see what's going on. So good evening from Israel, good morning, and let's start. Shalom.
Thank you so much, Eran and Bina, for co-hosting this webinar with us. My name is Jody Rudorin. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward, and we're really proud to not only be sponsoring this event with Bina, but to be working with Bina to co-curate a collection of essays and reflections from thought leaders in both of our countries about Rabin's assassination and how it looks 25 years later. I'm thrilled with that. We have really a powerful and large panel today. I'm going to do very brief introductions and then hopefully dive right in. For those of you who are joining us just now from Israel, from America, whatever, we encourage you to post comments or questions or helpful links in the chat, and we'll be doing the same. And as I said, we have a larger panel, but we'll hopefully get to incorporate a lot of your questions as well. So just a quick round of introductions. We have with us Tehila Friedman, who is a new member of the Knesset on Kachol V'Lavan. You'll all know Tehila, who made a huge splash with her first speech on the Knesset floor when she spoke about her politics as coming from a principled center and not a soft center, but a center of zealots. And we'll hear more about what that means from her. We also have Yochanan Plesner, a former member of the Knesset, leader from the Kadima party, who now runs the Israel Democracy Institute and who has some of the latest data and polling on exactly how Israelis are grappling with that dilemma of Jewish state and democracy. Also, we have with us Tova Birnbaum, who is the director of Jewish content at the JCC in Palo Alto. Tova is also Israeli. She was born in Bnei Brak in an ultra-Orthodox home and was one of the founders of the Bina secular yeshiva in Tel Aviv. We also have Yasser Okbi, who's a correspondent for Ma'ariv. He has more than 30 years experience as a journalist, covers Palestinian and Middle Eastern affairs, as well as the Israeli South. And we're thrilled to have him with us as well. And finally, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, senior rabbi of the Park Avenue Synagogue in Manhattan, and just a huge Jewish leader voice, serves on many boards, writes frequently in The Forward and the New York Times. And of course, the most important line of his bio is that he was the rabbi who married me in Chicago many years ago. We're going to start with Rabbi Cosgrove to bring us into the discussion with a few words of Torah.
Jody, thank you. And it's an honor to be here, to be part of this panel with so many friends, to be here with Bina, an organization that Park Avenue Synagogue has a close and getting closer relationship with, most evidently by my daughter, Madeline, who is there with Bina for the year. And that's all I'm going to say about that, so as not to embarrass her. I do also, Jody, as you know better than anyone else, know that here in America, I know people are here from all around the world. Today, October 27th, we acknowledge 2 years since the shooting in Pittsburgh at Tree of Life congregation, having married into the Pittsburgh Jewish community. It's a loss that we all feel, and perhaps will even come into our conversation of toxic loss of civility on both sides of the ocean. Begin with the following words. Memshelet Israel modia betadhema betzar rav uveyagon amok al moto shel Rosh HaMemshala v'sar habitachon Yitzhak Rabin, asher nirtzach bidei mitnakesh ha'erev b'Tel Aviv. HaMemshala titkanes be'od sha'a leyeshivat avel b'Tel Aviv, yehe zichro baruch. With horror, great sorrow, and deep grief, the government of Israel announces the death of Prime Minister and Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, murdered by an assassin tonight in Tel Aviv. The government shall convene in 1 hour for a morning session in Tel Aviv. May his memory be for a blessing. For the rest of my life, I will always remember where I was when I heard these words spoken. It was 25 years ago, and the voice was that of recently passed Eitan Haber, Prime Minister's bureau chief, outside the gates of Tel Aviv's Ichilov Hospital, just a short time after Rabin was declared dead on the operating table. I was in Tel Aviv that year, or in Jerusalem, as part of my JTS rabbinical training, a charged time marked by Oslo Accords, bus bombings, and demonstrations against the peace process. On that night of November 4th, 1995, hundreds of thousands, I believe, the numbers, were gathered in Tel Aviv's Kikar Malachei Yisrael for a massive pro-peace rally. I was a soldier for 27 years, boomed Rabin's voice. I believe there's a chance for peace, a great chance which must be seized. Violence is undermining the foundations of Israeli democracy. It must be rejected and condemned. It must be contained. It's not the way of the state of Israel. Democracy is our way. There may be differences, but they will be resolved in democratic elections. Rabin's final remarks would become immediately and horrifically prophetic as he was shot minutes later by an ultra-nationalist Jewish terrorist. On that Saturday evening, words quickly spread throughout Israel, a nation forever changed by Haber's update. In the hours and days and months that followed, I witnessed a dazed nation gasping for air, coming to grips not only with the murder of their prime minister, not only with the loss of a statesman whose very being was tied to the establishment of the nation, but the knowledge that it was another Jew who had shed his blood. I remember standing in the streets as Rabin's funeral procession passed by from the Knesset to Har Herzl. I remember the sirens sounding as a nation came to attention, called to account. I remember the words of President Clinton, who cited next week's Torah reading, that when Jews all around the world study the Torah portion in which God tests the faith of Abraham, the patriarch of the Jews and the Arabs, he commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Take your son, the one you love, Yitzhak. Clinton went on, as we all know, as Abraham in loyalty to God was about to kill his son, God spared Yitzhak. In the months to come, investigative panels reported the assassination resulted from a collapse of security. But what we all understood then, and all the more so now, was that Rabin's murder reflected the breakdown of something far more substantive than security protocol. How could it be that our people, so small and so surrounded by external threats, should discover that our greatest enemy was within? How did we not see it coming? The inflammatory rhetoric of the months leading up to the assassination, the bumper stickers of Rabin Boged, Rabin is a traitor, the leaflets depicting Rabin as an SS officer, and the deliberations of the right-wing religious community as to whether Rabin's actions were such a threat to Jewish life that his taking of his life could find justification within Jewish law. Rabin's murder signaled Israel's inability to house internal dissent democratically and civilly, a moment when one Jew became so unshakably convinced of the rightness of his own convictions that he denied the right of another Jew to hold otherwise, and in so doing, denied him of his very life. So I thank Bina, I thank the Forward, I thank the Ashman JCC for bringing us all together, all those who have made this hour of reflection possible, that we can look back on that moment 25 years henceforth, understanding it in its moment, in its ripple up to today, and perhaps offering an opportunity not just to honor Rabin, but to chart out a path for the future. Thank you. Toda.
Thank you, Rabbi Cosgrove, and thanks to everybody who's posted in the chat. We do indeed have an international audience. We have many people from Israel. I saw Anchorage, Alaska, Ohio, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Atlanta, and of course, California, Palo Alto. I'm going to actually ask each of our panelists. It was helpful, Elliot, and powerful to hear your own memory of where you were that day. You know, I think about in America, we think about everyone knows where they were on 9/11 or the Kennedy assassination, and surely the Rabin assassination is that way, both for Israelis of all kinds, and I think for many diaspora Jews as well. So I'm going to ask each of you to share briefly your own kind of where you were moment. We'll start with Tova, and then Yochanan, Yasser, and then Tehila.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, everyone. This is really a significant moment for me personally, sitting here in Palo Alto and seeing all the faces of really coming together to commemorate Rabin and to really think about what that moment did to our people and to the Jewish state. For me personally, as you read in my bio, Jody, I grew up in a very, very traditional community. I grew up in Bnei Brak, and I was a 17-year-old, very good girl, following the rules. And I was a senior in high school when that happened. I was part of a very right-wing high school, as Elliot, you called it, ultra-nationalist. So I was really, really in the midst of that community. And as many of you know, that day, November 4th, was also Yud Aleph Cheshvan, the 11th of Cheshvan. Traditionally, that's the day that Rachel Imenu, Rachel, has passed away. And we, the whole group, the class of girls, we were on the bus at the tomb of Rachel, Kever Rachel, actually. That was Motzei Shabbat. After Shabbat, we all went on the bus and we went to Kever Rachel. And we heard the news on the radio of the bus when we entered the parking lot. And the driver stopped the bus and told us what happened. And for me, that was a transformative moment because I looked at my teachers. I looked at the authority, the spiritual authority, the Jewish authority, and our teachers told us to just grab our sidurim, our prayer books, and pray. And I was wondering at that moment, okay, pray for what? What do I need to pray for? And then I looked at the window, and that was really what I saw changed me forever. I saw people dancing, people who came to commemorate the memory of Rachel Imenu, and they heard about what happened, the assassination of the Prime Minister of the Jewish state. And for them, the spontaneous response was joy and dancing. And for me, that was the moment where I started asking questions. I started asking questions about, do I have to choose between believing in democracy and human rights and equality and my Judaism? Do I have to make a choice? And as a 17-year-old girl, I made a choice. I wanted to be part of the democratic society and to believe in freedom. So I started a journey away from my traditional community. It was a very, very long journey, very painful one. But then I was very lucky to discover Bina when I was 25. And Bina taught me that I don't really have to choose, that Judaism has deep, deep values that support democracy and equality and human rights and compassion and respect. And I was very lucky to be part of a group of teachers who started the secular yeshiva, where we really try to invite as many young Israelis as possible to have this conversation and to be part of the conversation of what is Judaism and what should a Jewish state look like. And to have people from all over the spectrum, secular, religious, traditional, men, women, Arab Israelis, everyone, to be around the table and to discuss that question of what should a Jewish state look like and what is Judaism and how do we not have to choose between our values of democracy and equality and Judaism. And I am very grateful to kind of continue this journey now in California when I work at the Ashman Family JCC to expand that conversation also with American Jews and to have a conversation about how we all connect with Israel and how do we create this tolerant Judaism that I discovered together.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Yochanan, go ahead.
Well, first of all, it's great to thanks for having me, and thanks for Forward and Bina and all the participants for putting together this important event and opportunity for dialogue across the ocean, both Israel and in the US. And it's quite interesting to speak immediately after Tova because there are many similarities in our stories because it's a transformative moment, but obviously some acute differences as well. So back in 1995, I'm just fresh out of quite a few years as a combatant and officer in special forces, very, very much a transformative experience, but not something that connects you to Israeli public life. And essentially, I went to that event, to that rally to support Prime Minister Rabin, and this was my first event in which I reclaimed my civilian identity. And after many years that you are used to not, you don't have the time and the mindset to get involved in public life. So it's actually the first time that I did something of that sort. And I mentioned before in a conversation as the rally was folding up and we began to disperse, I told a friend, I said, if something is to happen now, some assassination, actually what I meant is I thought of a terror attack more and something that will attack the participants. I didn't really think of an assassin that would assassinate the prime minister, but I said now is the time when security is much loose, and if I were to instigate a terror attack, I would do it right now. And it was perhaps 100 or 200 meters away from the actual place and time where the assassination actually occurred. And obviously it was a major shock for all of us and for me personally. And my sentiment was to some extent some sentiment of guilt as well, because Prime Minister Rabin was trying to take Israel through a path to serve all of us, but he was alone there confronting the protesters and all the rest. We were sort of minding our own business, and I felt to some extent responsible that I didn't do more to get involved, to take charge, to once we see that the discourse and level of discourse is deteriorating, to help block and stop it. And this led me to become, it was freshman at college, as you say in the US, and it led me to become actually more publicly involved. And one of the involvements, rather than just being a student, And one of the involvements was to take on a position as personal assistant to the president of the then new think tank, the Israel Democracy Institute. And then 2 decades later, after a few additional rounds of public involvement, I returned to that organization as to head it. So this actually led me to the first position that did not involve carrying a handgun.
Yeah. Yasser, where were you on that night 25 years ago?
Good morning, good evening for everyone here. I think the remember of the murder, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin make me all the time sad, because I followed also the Arab newspapers, the Arab follow the peace process in these days, and I think that it was a very big the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was unfortunately the most successful political assassination in the 20th century. I think that he stopped the war for also from the Israeli Arabs here in Israel, the Arabs in Israel. We was in the euphoria and how to improve our situation here and as citizens in Israel, Arab citizens in Israel, and I think that in these days, we also achieve the most civilian rights. As I am from a recognized village in near Hura in the Negev, and so we dream about something else. And the murder of Yitzhak Rabin caught me in Lut in this days. I was with my family. I was 25 years old, and with my little boy children, and visiting my father and mother-in-law. It was 20 kilometers from there, the assassination. So it shocked me, because with him it was the beginning of a great period, and I believe that finally there was a beginning of the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was in many people's eyes not only a tragedy of the Yasar, the Yasar in Arabic, the small, the left wing of the Israeli, but it stopped the solution that we dreamed about in these days. Yigal Amir, unfortunately, wanted to stop Israel giving up the lands in the West Bank and to have a solution with the Palestinian. And he believed that this land is the gift of God for Jews. So he didn't, and he doesn't, till these days, think that people can live together. Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister, the Prime Minister that he gave maybe the best things to the citizens here in Arab citizens here in Israel. And I speak about this in the beginning of this Zoom meeting speak about Bitsar Rav Ubiyagon Rav Itan Haber that he died recently, and I remember these words like I hear them now, and I was and I was in the war in my way from Lud to Beersheba, and I was, and till now I was, until now I am very sad about this assassination, because this assassination, I again say it was the most successful political assassination in this century, in 2019 century. Yes.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that later, but I want to just get to, okay, Friedman, share with us, please, briefly, where you were on that night and your memory of how you experienced the assassination. Heard the news.
I was sitting with my boyfriend. He was a settler. And we sat in a coffee shop in Jerusalem, and we heard the news. And I remember praying, God, I wish it's Arab, and it's not Jewish. And then we heard he was shot by a Jew. And then I remember praying, I wish he's not a settler. And it's interesting because one side of me couldn't really believe that it can happen. You know, that a Jew can murder our prime minister. And yet I prayed. I mean, there was another part of me that thought it might, eventually might came from this side of the map. Now, I came from the very mainstream of the religious Zionist community. It didn't take me out, but it did. It took me to a long journey of combining humanistic and religion with identity, values, create a long journey of creating a humanistic orthodoxy, making my commitment to human values and tradition and orthodoxy, and finding ways to make it live together. Last sentence, I would say it was an earthquake, really. I felt like it was hard to walk at this night because I felt the land doesn't stand still.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, actually, as Yochanan was talking about thinking it was a terrorist attack, I was wondering a little bit, just exactly what you were talking about as to whether the Israeli Jewish consciousness before the assassination, like sort of even allowed for the possibility or not, and kind of how much this was, I mean, it's similar to some different, it feels like in the last number of years, we just keep having something even more insane kind of happening, and particularly with violence, right? And you sort of can't even imagine the level of a school shooting or whatever until it happens. And it's interesting to hear you say that even as a young woman, that your instant thought was, please let it not be one of us, one of mine, one of my tribe. And that is such a defining part, I think, of Israelis' struggle with democracy, is that kind of tribalism. I want to turn to you, Yochanan, to tell us a little bit about, both the current view, the right now view, and a little bit of the historical view about what data we have that tells us a little bit about taking the temperature of the health of the democracy.
Well, the sort of immediate lesson from immediately after the murder was, we need to find, it's okay to argue and have disputes and differences within a democracy, but we need to find a way to regulate those differences, to decide how we argue and how and what kind of institutions and how the discourse should look like, and generally to find a a way to bring together the different groups, tribes, because we are one big tribe and then many sub-tribes within it, as our president now even labeled it, if you will, formally. So this was the sort of the main aspiration, if you will. We need to find a better way to identify this, a common denominator, and adopt a different kind of a discourse and a method for disagreeing. And fast forward now 25 years, it's not a linear progression, but fast forward, and we at IDI, we sort of took a poll just about a week ago towards this Yortzeit of the Rabin murder. And what we've discovered is that to some extent, those lessons have not been learned. So a huge majority of Israelis, not only do they think there are high levels of incitement within Israeli society, but they see themselves as the victims of that incitement. So about 84%, sorry, the figure is actually about 86% of those who self-identify themselves as left-wing see themselves as targets of incitement, and more than 80% of ultra-Orthodox and around 70% of Israeli Arabs, and in the high 60s of those who identify themselves as right-wing. So basically, all of us in huge numbers see ourselves as the targets, as the victims of incitement. And as we know, when people feel the sentiment of fear and of being victims, there's no psychological openness for what we call cheshbon nefesh, for candid, open dialogue. Where do I go wrong? Where do I need to take responsibility, and so on. So this is one figure that is very alarming. And the second figure, very briefly, I'll give two more figures. And one is that about half of Israelis think that a political assassination is likely. And this, again, is unlike in the mid-90s, where we thought it's inconceivable, and so did Rabin himself, who refused to use more safety measures, and the Shabak itself didn't even prepare for that. So it wasn't part of the thinking, and today it's almost a mainstream thought, about half of Israelis. And finally, a good point of data is that there's a high level of commitment to democratic values across the board. I mean, the lowest level is we identify as within the ultra-Orthodox community, and even there about 70% support the combination of Jewish and democratic and are committed to democratic values. Again, there might be differences in the interpretation of what it means to be a democracy, but but Israelis by and large see themselves committed to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, both components of that problematic definition of a national identity. So there's serious challenges, but also a lot to work with.
So as many of you know, I spent a few years on the ground there in Jerusalem as the bureau chief for the New York Times from 2012 to 2016. And my biggest takeaway, or my simplest takeaway, I'll say, from that time was to sort of feel like the whole place was very much in a PTSD from the second Intifada. But I've been thinking more about that now, and thinking about maybe I misunderstood that, or maybe that trauma really was coming within a post-traumatic stress disorder from the Rabin assassination. I wonder, Tova and Tehila, how you see that. Do you feel that the society, and as in your leadership, in your kind of working with community groups, are you feeling like that how defining of an experience does that still feel like 25 years on? Obviously, so many things have happened since then, and it's hard to pinpoint. But I wonder whether you think of the place as in PTSD from the murder.
Jody, I remember in the late 90s, there was kind of an optimism because hundreds of new organizations were founded, like grassroots organizations, good people who saw the polarization, who identified the problems, and really try to fix them. And I remember Bina was part of that. And basically what the hope was is to create Jewish language around humanistic values. Because many times post-traumatic disorder is because you don't articulate what you're feeling and you don't have words to say, okay, what just happened? I don't even know how to analyze that. And unfortunately, even today, a lot of pockets in the Israeli community don't have words to talk about what kind of a Jewish state do I want to see? How do I really use values of tikkun olam, of all those beautiful words that we actually Israelis are learning from American Judaism, who was able to articulate all those values in the Jewish language. This is a process that started in the late 90s, and there was this feeling of, wow, we're going to fix this. We're going to really come out stronger on the other side, and to go into the education system. And that's basically what Bina is doing, going into the schools and helping young students to articulate values in a Jewish language, to really take ownership on what it is to have a Jewish and democratic state and to live it. And I must say that looking at the streets today in Israel, one does ask whether that attempt was successful, whether those dozens and hundreds of organizations, that most of them are still active, were able to transform their rhetorics, were able to help people analyze and understand what Jewish is for them, or is it just circles, those bubbles that we are in, and we feel very successful because we like to kind of cuddle in those circles. So that's, I think, today, 25 years after, is the time to really examine that and to see, okay, maybe we need to rethink how are we healing Israeli society.
Tila?
You know what? Not enough. I mean, if we had a trauma from the Rabin assassination, it's not deep enough.
Because
really.
you haven't sort of course corrected enough?
Yes, I think your first analysis was more accurate. I think the trauma of the second Intifada is deep. It's not so. I think in Jerusalem, I'm Jerusalemite, and I lived in the city in those years, and they were really horrible, and we never speak about them. We never ever mention those years of, you know, buses and coffee shops and bombing and empty streets and this fear of you leave home in the morning and you really don't know if you're gonna come back. We never ever speak about it. It's quite amazing. Now you said that, and I'm thinking you don't even listen to the music of those. It's like something. It's something truly. So, like, we really buried it. While I agree with Tova that the Rabin assassination was in a way digest, and there was like a civil effort to do something with it, and yet not enough. And what is shocking for me, that back then I could put my finger on what we are fighting over. Okay, there was a real dispute in society. Okay, you could be for and against peace process, for and against settlements. Now I'm looking around and I'm thinking, what are we fighting over? What is a question that makes us, that makes the hate level so high? And it's quite amazing because, look, there is a personal question of Netanyahu, which is not only personal, it's a question of having a prime minister who's accused, in criminal I don't know how to say Omed Ledin, but so that's a serious question, but not it doesn't justify the level of social tension.
Right. I want to, you're relatively new in, as an elected official, and it's an interesting time, right? There's some measures of Israeli democracy that feel very healthy. You have elections every 15 minutes or so. So there's been a lot of debates over whether that's a sign of health or a sign of brokenness. But there are these, as you talk about, these like intense tensions among Israeli Jews over things like religion in the public sphere and other things. And there, of course, was the several rounds of debate over the nation state law, which brought into intense focus the question of Arab citizens of Israel and what it means to be in a Jewish state. And we had a question from the audience. Debbie Weissman asked, what does it mean to have a democracy run by Jewish values? What does that mean for the Arab citizens of Israel? So I'm going to ask Yasser to start briefly to talk a little bit about how the question of Israel's democratic health sits in your community, and then maybe everyone else can jump in. We can unmute Yasser. Can you unmute there, Yasser? Do we have?
So you need to unmute yourself.
There you go. Nope, you're still muted. Okay.
Unmute. Okay.
Okay.
Now, I think that it is the Arab in Israel. I want to say something else. Maybe that Rabin's successor in the leadership of Israeli government was equally willing to implement the Oslo agreement, and so the Palestinian leadership, if he Yasser Arafat or the Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, also did not have the ability to accept a compromise solution necessary to reach a solution. In the Arab here, look to themselves, to ourselves as a bridge to the Arab country or the world of the Arab. So it's the Jewish community went right after the assassination of Rabin, and the racism was very bigger than the period of the Rabin. And unfortunately, we stand here as okay. We also looking forward to improve our situation in the Negev, in the Galil, and in the Mishulash, in the middle end of Israel, and to change things. I think that the leadership in Israel nowadays can't change a lot for the Arabs. Maybe it will change in the 10 years, or maybe more, less than 10 years in the future. And I think that it's very, for me, I look for this as very the huge gap from the Jewish and the Arab will be not good for the future of this state.
Rabbi Cosgrove, I want to bring you back into the conversation and help bring to the fore the sort of diaspora or American Jewish perspective, and particularly from the perspective of what they call in Israel, at least the liberal streams, right? The reform and conservative movements. And how do you feel like your congregants, your constituents, the people, the American Jewish community sees the state of Israeli democracy? And I think people here are concerned both about the question of religious freedom for Jews and the struggles over the Haredi control over so many religious institutions in Israel, as well as human rights for both Arab citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank.
Yeah, I think the yard of Prime Minister Rabin brings those issues into focus. I think that the progressive values held near and dear to the liberal movements in the States, not just religious freedom, but also can a Jew be both progressive in their politic as well as fiercely Zionist. It's very rare that you have such a value system situated on one individual as you did with Rabin. And so when I think about this moment, I think it's really a case of a road not taken for American Jewry. There's an ache, Jody, and that's beyond expression of that's frankly playing out in the Jewish community today about loyalty tests. Where should Jews, are we more concerned about anti-Semitism, or are we more concerned about progressive values? These are painful conversations that are tearing apart our community, and I have to be honest, there's a sense that Rabin might have been our last best chance of seeing those values together.
When I was still the Jerusalem bureau chief was in late 2013, I think, is when, actually now I'm getting the dates wrong, I apologize, but when the nation state law was first introduced and the government broke up over it, maybe was that coming into the 15 elections, maybe? Anyway, Tzipi Livni asked Ruth Gavison, Zichrona Livracha, to take a look back at the Declaration of Independence and to sort of prepare a brief about the nation state law and kind of how to think about it in that context, constitutional scholarship. And I remember doing a story about that Gavison basically said, don't look too close. Don't look too close at our founding documents, because there's really a conflict here between being a Jewish state and a democracy. And we sort of took a leap to create the state, partly because of the trauma that we were, responding to in the Holocaust. And it's a little hard to square the circle. And you can see in the chat various people in the audience saying, what's more important, being a Jewish state, being a democratic state? And I think the fundamental question really is, can Israel be both? And what does it mean to be both? And I feel like that was probably a question in 1948. It's been a question like ever since. I'm sure it was a question right after the murder. And it feels like one of the defining questions now that everybody's struggling with. So I'd love to hear everybody's, I'm sure it's a yes or no question. Can Israel be both Jewish and democratic? And what does that look like?
Well, I'll jump in. And obviously we had this discussion in the past, and my answer is yes. And actually a majority of Israelis hold on to this combination dearly, and obviously without making it possible. And it's perhaps the biggest challenge and goal and task of Zionism and of the Zionist state is to prove that it can be fully and truly democratic and at the same time a Jewish state, obviously not in the religious sense, not a religious state, but the Jewish in the cultural and national perspective. I'd like to refer to what Tehillah said before about what is it that we were arguing about then and what are we arguing about today? Because we're seeing that the level of incitement and confrontation is just as high, perhaps even higher today. Then we were arguing about real questions of life and death, territories and security policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Then we had the second Intifada, and we didn't argue as much during the second Intifada. It's a huge trauma, but it actually brought us together. So the rift and we actually also now marking the 20th Yortzeit of the second Intifada. So it's 25 for the Rabin assassination and 20 for the second Intifada. So one pulled us apart and one brought us together. And 25 years later, what we're arguing today, and that's perhaps even worse, we're arguing about questions of the rules of the game, about democracy itself, about what it means to be a democratic state. So 80% of Israelis believe that democracy is an essential component of the definition of Zionism. But what it means to be a democracy, do we need an independent judiciary? How do we preserve and secure free discourse, and at the same time, and of course, how do we ensure that there in the principle of separation of powers? All of these things are intensely in debate. It's part of a broader crisis of democracy that is taking place throughout the democratic world. And as Tehila mentioned before, in Israel, we also have the Netanyahu factor that adds on top of it. So we have our own questions of tribes and divisions. We have the crisis of democracy over the past decade throughout the democratic world. And then we have to top it all off, the Netanyahu factor. And this brings us toward, to use the cliche, a perfect democratic storm that we're confronting these days.
Tehila?
I must say that I'm not sure. We always describe this dichotomy between Jewish and democratic states, though almost every question is a dispute, is machloket within Judaism and within democracy. So I'm not sure this is a dichotomy. I'll give example. Okay, the question of women, feminism. So you can describe it as, Jewish versus democratic, but you can also say there is a huge Jewish dispute over it. I mean, I would argue on my place as a woman, even if there was no democracy, I would do it in Jewish language, in the language of Zachar v'Nekeva bara otam, of, being created in the image of God, seeing feminism as Geulah, as a religious rhythm. I mean, I can give a whole speech. I did it 1,000 times in my life in Jewish language, explaining feminism. And, and you can do the opposite, obviously. And I can also have this debate in democratic language between liberal democracy versus multicultural democracy. I mean, think of France. Respecting the right to have a communal culture versus, equal rights. And I mean, those questions are not necessarily Jewish versus democracy. I'm not sure that's the right way to put it. And I'm pretty sure that's not a healthy way to put it. And I must say, I just heard Rabbi Elliott, and I want to say we also moved forward. I mean, today you can find partners for feminism within ultra-Orthodox community. You can find partners for, I mean, I can go over each and every community in Israel, and I can show how within this community you can find forces that working toward more humanistic values, while you can have forces who are pushing toward more what I call zealotry. So I'm not sure we only moved backward. I think in many ways we moved forward.
Thank you for that. And we are close to the hour, but you teed up what I wanted to have as my final question. I'm going to ask for sort of a last word from everybody on really just this basic question of, do you feel like Israel's democracy is healthier, stronger, more mature today than it was 25 years ago, or the opposite? And again, just a kind of a brief comment on that, and then Zach Bodner is going to close us out. So we'll do, how about Yasser, Rabbi Cosgrove, Yochanan, and then Tova, since Tehila basically just answered that. Yasser, very briefly, do you think the democracy is healthier today or less advanced?
I think that in Israel nowadays we have a lot of democracy for Jewish and a lot of democracy for Arabs. And I signed before that the period of Rabin was a very huge change in this acceptable of the other here in Israel, the Arab, the Druze, the Bedouin, all the minority. And I think that it was very the extremist say in the talkbook back or in the mainstream of the webs here in Israel make the change of we can read there a lot of anti-Arab here. Also the peace with the Emirate and Bahrain and Sudan and etc. I think that the Jewish here and the leadership of Israel must change their words in order to make sure that this extremist cannot be good for Israel for the future. And I think that in these days, while we speak about the peace with the Arab states, the change must be from the leadership, from Netanyahu, from the ministers there in the government that must change their word in order to make sure that democracy is good for all of us here in this land. And first of all, I think that the change must be inside the Jewish community, from the West, from the right wing and from the left wing. They can change the speech, and if they change the speech together, one with the other, they can change the speech also with the others that's they're not Jewish.
Thank you.
Yes.
Elliot?
I don't know, Jody. I'm reminded of that quotation from Churchill about democracy being the worst form of government except for the others, right? I don't know, is Israeli democracy, there's no darker day than the day that a prime minister gets assassinated. And so everything else seems to be better. But that's a pretty low bar here. I think democracy is under threat from all corners in all countries. It's a very, very dangerous time for democracy right now.
Let me ask you something else, Elliot, because I think what Tehillah said when she said that she thinks that the idea of Jewish and democratic being set into opposition is flawed, and I think that's a good point. But as our resident rabbi here for a second, can you, Bekitzur, can you give us a word on, I mean, is democracy like an inherently Jewish value, or would democracy be the sort of Jewish way, the best Jewish way? I see lots of things.
I agree with everything Tehillah said about the ability to to hold multiple ideas all at the same time, and it's not one or the other. And it's not so much that there's sort of a tractate democracy in the Talmud, but if rabbinic dialogue models anything, it's an ability to countenance views civilly that are not your own. And so that very, very notion is as Tehillah knows as well as anyone, built into the Jewish tradition.
And is the foundation of democracy, right? So
though we should admit into Jewish tradition, but not into Jewish history. We're doing poor job always.
But striving to be better. Right? Okay, Yochanan and Tova, a final word. We are over time, so just one last thought each.
Well, go ahead, Tova.
So I am thinking about Jewish history. We don't have a lot of examples of Jewish sovereignty, and definitely not a democratic one. So going back to our tradition, sometimes we kind of need to look at it in new eyes and really have deep conversations about what is Jewish and democratic now, when everybody's asking what is democracy and what is Judaism. And really also here in Palo Alto, we ask the same questions. And if we gather from different perspectives in Israel and in the world, I think that can be helpful. So I'm just hoping that that would be an optimistic tone for us to keep asking the question and to strive to getting into a better future together.
Well, ours is a very short example of a young democracy, and our previous example of sovereignty ended about 70 years later, so we're already in overtime. If we compare to 25 years ago, I would say in some aspects we're better. For example, attitude towards LGBT, and even in some aspects to the Arab minority. And in other areas, the challenges are much greater and could not have been imagined 25 years ago. So the challenges are great. We are young, and we will have to write our own history.
It is a good reminder. Israel is barely an adolescent as a country, right? So thank you all. Thanks for being a great panel. Audience, stick with us. Zach Bodner has a closing word, but thanks to Binan and thank you from the Forward for joining us.
Thank you, Jody. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us today, whatever time it is, wherever you are, because we have people joining us from all over the world. I especially want to thank our speakers, to Tehillah Friedman and Yochanan Plesner, my old friend Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, Tova Birnbaum, Yasser Okbi, and our talented moderator, Jody Ruderin, our opening speaker, Aran Baruch, and I want to thank Elliot Weisrub Glassenberg for his technical support behind the scenes. This has been a great collaboration between the Forward, Binan, and the OFJCC. And I am Zach Bodner, the CEO of the JCC, and I've just been privileged to bring you just a couple minutes of closing remarks. Look, I had the opportunity to meet Prime Minister Rabin in 1994 when I was living in Jerusalem, studying at Hebrew University, my junior year in college. I went to a tekes, a ceremony for Yom HaZikaron on Ammunition Hill. And Rabin spoke, and he made such an impassioned plea for peace. I was so moved. I went up to him after his speech. I went to thank him, to shake his hand. Rabin actually was one of the people who most inspired me and set me on my life path, which I feel like is serving the Jewish people by working especially to improve Israeli diaspora relations. And I can't help but think it was only 18 months after that moment when another young man approached Rabin after he gave another powerful speech at another large gathering. But at that time, it wasn't to shake his hand and thank him for inspiring him. It was to end his life. It was to stop Rabin's audacious plans for peace. It was to end his work to heal the rifts between us and to help make the world a better place. Now, as we all know, Rabin gave his life for the cause of peace, and I believe we should honor his memory by continuing this cause, not just for peace between Israel and her neighbors, but also peace between ourselves, peace between brothers and sisters, peace between the Jewish people. The polarization between us has already had deadly consequences, and we must end it now. We must show that we can live together, left and right, Orthodox and secular, West Bank settler and Berkeley student, Republican and Democrat. We have to recognize that we have a shared legacy and a common destiny. This is the central premise of so much of our work here at the OFJCC in Palo Alto. We launched the Z3 project 7 years ago to reimagine diaspora-Israel relations, to bring us together, Israelis and diaspora Jews of all different stripes, to find a way to honor our differences and rise above them. Our goal is to strive for unity, not uniformity. We know that despite our differences, we're still one people. It's like the Talmudic story that Rav Soloveitchik told on Israel's 8th Independence Day. It's a story about the father who came to the rabbi asking for 2 blessings for his newborn son. And the rabbi asked, why 2? Did he have twins? And the father said, no, but his son was born with 2 heads. And the rabbi pondered this question. He pondered this dilemma, and then he offered the following Solomonic solution. He said, the father needed to pour hot water on one head, and if the other reacted in pain, then it was indeed 1 child, not 2. And that is indeed the Jewish people. We have more than 1 head, but we have 1 body, 1 soul. When Jews are shot and killed in Poway, in Pittsburgh, or in Paris, you in Israel, you cry out in pain. And when Jews in Sderot or Kiryat Shmona have missiles launched at you, we cry out in pain in the diaspora. We are one, and we have to remember that. Look, you can explore this topic more deeply with us, with more nuance and more people across the globe at our annual Z3 experience, which is going to be virtual this year, entirely virtual the week of Hanukkah. I invite you all to join us. We'll put the link in the chat. But I also want to announce that we're going to be launching for the first time ever this spring in partnership with Bina, a new gap year experience called the Jewish Leap Year. LEAP is an acronym that stands for Learning, Experience, Action, and Peoplehood. It brings diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews together for a year between high school and college or between high school and the army. Part of the time will be spent in Israel and part of the time in the diaspora. Together, they'll spend time learning about our Jewish heritage, volunteering for social action, and like Nachshon, they'll be taking the leap toward a new future. This is just one example of how we can actually bring Jews together, Jews living in Israel and the diaspora. It's how we can weave our people together, transcending our divides, so that once again, we can feel the love and respect for one another, so we can end the polarization and the vilification that took Rabin's life. So on this day, in this moment, may Yitzhak Rabin's memory not only be a blessing, but an opportunity of learning for all of us. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us and wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful evening. Take care. Thank you.